Canadians are dealing with a crisis that no other first world citizens are facing. The water is undrinkable. Entire communities are left without access to proper healthcare, dying at disproportionate rates. High rates of unemployment are rampant, child poverty is at an all-time high, and women go missing without ever being found. And the federal government is responsible for it all. Nothing is done because of who this is happening to. This is the story of the Canadian First Nations. First Nations, also known as the Indigenous Peoples of Canada, have been systematically oppressed by the federal government of Canada since the arrival of the first ships in the 1400s. The most recent plot to disenfranchise them occurred in the late 1800s and lasted into the 1990s, when the federal government introduced a new form of education program meant to assimilate the Indigenous people of Canada. They were called residential schools. Children who were taken from their families were sent to these schools where they were stripped of their First Nation identity. At these schools, they endured abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, and even death. First Nations endured this ongoing trauma for over 100 years. While the federal government has apologized for its role in developing residential schools, the lasting effects on First Nations living on and off reserves have caused generations of problems. There are two classifications of First Nations, on-reserve and off-reserve. On-reserve First Nations refer to Indigenous people living in remote communities initially established by the federal government for the occupancy of a First Nation group. Reserves were created as part of the process of making treaty agreements between the federal government and First Nations. Now, these reserves represent some of the most underserved and disparate places in Canada. First Nations in Canada are 3 times more likely to experience domestic violence. Indigenous male and female youth are 10 to 21 times more likely to commit suicide than their non-native counterparts. They are 12 times more likely to go missing or be murdered. 4 in 10 Indigenous children are in poverty, and over 100 First Nations communities are currently on water advisory warnings. 1/2 of on-reserve First Nations meet the criteria for metabolic syndrome, a cluster of conditions that are directly caused by obesity. The most common cause of mortality in adult Indigenous people is circulatory disease, a direct causality of the obesity rate, and the most common cause of mortality in Indigenous youth is suicide. This situation has been labeled an epidemic by First Nations groups across Canada. But this epidemic is not being treated, as First Nations lack preventative healthcare services, and the primary healthcare they do receive is fraught with racial discrimination which prevents equitable care. As was the case with Joyce Echaquan, an Indigenous mother of 7 who went to the hospital on September 28, 2020, complaining of stomach pains, and died shortly after recording herself being insulted and belittled by hospital staff. This cannot be acceptable to Canadians. This cannot be the legacy of Canada. We have to think about the value of increasing the quality of life for First Nations in Canada, because there is inherent value in it. Improving upon healthcare and water quality for First Nations means better mental health, fewer doctor visits, and a greater ability to engage in the job market. As it stands, Indigenous people in Canada are not pursuing their abilities to the full extent that non-native Canadians are, and in this way, Canada is saying that it is okay that there is a portion of society who can struggle. But while they struggle to survive, their absence leaves all of Canada at a disadvantage. When every member of Canada is thriving, all of Canada thrives. The path to Indigenous justice is not one that requires unimaginable change. It begins with the federal government recognizing their role to play and using their power to establish standards on access to healthcare and clean drinking water quality that have to be met by the provinces. With federal funding, the provinces can establish clean drinking water for all First Nations, provide primary and preventative healthcare for each Native Canadian on and off reserve. But that standard cannot be limited to just one government. It must be federally mandated to ensure that all future governments of Canada are required to provide equitable service to First Nations by stating that provincial and federal governments are equally responsible for the providing of culturally appropriate healthcare and clean drinking water to First Nations. By putting forward policy changes and structural reform for First Nations peoples' overall improvement will result in improvement for Canada. We need to allow First Nations to flourish the same way that Canadians have, with access to universal healthcare, clean drinking water, and federally mandated standards to First Nations quality of life. First Nations can begin to provide even more to Canada. In doing so, we can turn this crisis into an opportunity.